Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. This is Module 5, which is going to be on the question of free will or agency. And let's get right to it. So way back in Module 1, Bertrand Russell described philosophy as a confrontation with the boundaries of the knowable, right? And with Socratic modesty, we accept the limitations of our understanding. We know what we don't know. Yet we constantly push back against this horizon by testing the technologies of our reasoning against the most momentous questions, sharpening our critical tools and training ourselves to reflexively challenge the tyrannies of custom and common sense. For example, consider our intuitions about criminal justice, and this goes back to the Beardsleys from Module 1. If we believe that criminals must be punished for their crimes, then we implicitly accept that they had the choice to act otherwise, right? They could have chosen not to do the crime. To punish someone for an action that they had no choice but to perform, that doesn't sound like justice. That sounds like arbitrary cruelty. Now, Descartes split the mind from the world precisely to rescue our intuitive sense of ourselves as free, autonomous agents from the blind clockwork mechanism of deterministic nature. But are we justified in making that exception? We depend upon the world's dependability, don't we? Science, technology, and society, they're all founded upon the assumption that effects follow necessarily from causes. That the world is something that can ultimately be understood, explained, and predicted. Without that reliable clockwork machinery, we would be rudderless, with no ability to navigate or have any control over our fates. And that's the paradox of agency, right? If the universe lacks order and necessity, then we're lost in chaos. But that same order and necessity traps us within the clockwork. We are part of nature, and we seem to have no good reason for assuming that we are unique exceptions to its iron rule of uniformity. So is there some middle ground that can be found between these two extremes? Some reasonable compromise between inexplicable randomness on the one hand and exceptionalist predetermination on the other. So Stephen M. Kahn is going to set the stage for this debate, which is the debate ultimately between free will and determinism. Kahn's going to set the stage for this by revisiting the infamous trial of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. And I'm not going to get deep into the Leopold and Loeb case. You can read about it in Kahn's article if you want to have a fuller picture of it. But Leopold and Loeb basically stood accused of kidnapping and murder. Their attorney, who was Clarence Darrow, very famous attorney of the time, employed a surprising strategy in their defense. Rather than denying their guilt, which is what a normal attorney would probably do in that circumstance, Darrow argued instead that his clients were not morally responsible for their actions. So they did it, but they weren't morally responsible. They had no agency. They weren't free to do otherwise. Darrow, in effect, puts human agency itself on trial. Now, Kahn is going to formalize Darrow's argument as follows. Premise 1. No action is free if it must occur. Premise 2. Every event has antecedent conditions that ensure that it must occur. Conclusion. Therefore, no action is free. Now, if this argument is sound, if that's right, if human actions aren't truly free, then moral responsibility is an illusion, right? It's a sort of comforting story that we tell ourselves to obscure the rather unsettling fact that our prisons are overflowing with convicts who never had a genuine choice in their actions. Now, in this deterministic vision, the convict's crime and the judge's punishment are both inevitabilities, right? Neither one of them could have done otherwise. It's all the playing out of forces predetermined from the birth of the universe, from the Big Bang. This playing out of this causal chain. We're locked in this grim cycle, right? Endlessly reenacting these empty scripted rituals of crime and retribution that could have never occurred otherwise. It couldn't have been otherwise. The convict never had a choice but to do the crime, and the judge and the jury never had a choice but to convict. Now, the debate surrounding this argument has crystallized over the centuries, really. into three principal metaphysical positions. And we're still within the realm of metaphysics here when we're talking about free will and agency. So, the first one is hard determinism, which accepts both of Darrow's premises and his conclusion. So, no action is free if it must occur. Every event has antecedent conditions that ensure that it must occur. Therefore, no action is free. Hard determinists accept all of that. Compatibilism, sometimes called soft determinism, only rejects the first premise, that no action is free if it must occur. It accepts premise two, that every event has antecedent conditions that ensure that it must occur, but it rejects that no action is free if it must occur. That's compatibilism. And libertarianism, or metaphysical libertarianism, which is a different thing than the political philosophy of libertarianism, which we're going to look at in Module 7, the metaphysical libertarian, the free will libertarian, rejects the second premise, that every action has antecedent conditions that ensure that it must occur. So those are our three positions: hard determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism. And we're going to look at each one of those in turn. So the heart of the hard determinist position lies with the thesis that the past, combined with natural laws, necessitates only one possible future. There's only one way that the world could have turned out. The French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace captured this worldview through his famous demon thought experiment. And yes, another demon. Philosophy has lots of demons. Laplace's demon, unlike Descartes' demon, Laplace's demon is an intellect that is capable of knowing the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. So, with this perfect knowledge of the present state of the universe, it knows where every particle is and its momentum, how fast it's going. With that perfect knowledge of the present state of the universe, such an intellect would be able to calculate with absolute certainty both the entire past and the entire future of the cosmos. No uncertainty would remain. The most distant future and the furthest past would be equally present before the gaze of the demon, right? It can see it's omniscient. It can see everything. It knows everything that has happened, everything that will happen. The universe is reduced to a single mathematical equation, right? One that contains the complete history of everything that was, is, and shall be. Now, Laplace's demon embodies essentially the dream of the scientific revolution, right? A universe that's characterized by comprehensible and predictable uniformity. It's shaped by explicable forces. We can explain it. It's available to systemization by reason. We can understand it. And we're capable of transforming it through technology because we're able to explain it and predict it. So we can be active agents who are able to shape it to further our ends, our goals, our survival, our flourishing, etc. The problem is, the same vision appears to foreclose the entire possibility of human agency, our ability to act autonomously and to engage with the world as free agents, because it reduces us to part of that clockwork. So the question is, can both of these intuitions be preserved? Can we remain causally active agents, autonomous agents, and also have a universe that is predictable, that is ultimately explicable? So the question is, can both of these intuitions be preserved, right? Can we continue to think of ourselves as autonomous agents that are able to engage actively and freely with the world, but also inhabit a universe that is comprehensible, predictable, that has some uniformity, that obeys laws that are comprehensible to human reasoning? Patricia Churchland is going to offer one potential response to this, and it's going to come from the hard determinist direction, and it's going to be grounded in contemporary neuroscience, right? So Churchland's going to argue that as neuroscience continues to uncover the mechanisms regulating human choices, we're going to need to modify our understanding of what freedom means accordingly. So choices are ultimately made, on Churchland's view, by brains. And brains operate causally. They operate according to the laws of physical causation. The traditional conception of free will as independent from causal influence is therefore untenable. It's no longer a position that we can maintain. Instead, Churchland is going to redefine freedom as neural self-control, the capacity for higher brain functions to regulate more primitive impulses, right? So she's going to ground that in neurology. What varies between individuals is not some metaphysical freedom from causation, but rather the neural complexity and effectiveness of these self-regulatory mechanisms. So freedom isn't an all-or-nothing affair here. It's a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree of neural complexity and neural control by these higher order brain functions over more primitive impulses. So Churchland suggests that abandoning this metaphysical conception of free will doesn't necessarily entail that we abandon the notion of social accountability or moral responsibility. Even in a fully determined world, punishment serves a crucial function, in her view. It shapes neural connections that regulate future behavior. So it's a form of conditioning, essentially. We punish not because people could have done otherwise, in some metaphysical sense, but because punishment is causally effective in shaping behavior and in maintaining social order. So applied to the Leopold and Loeb case, Churchland's approach would grant that their actions were determined by their neural states, which themselves were shaped by genetics, by development, and by the environment. Yet this wouldn't necessarily excuse them from punishment, which would still serve its social function of discouraging similar behavior in others. But does this solution effectively preserve either our intuitions regarding agency or our intuitions regarding moral accountability and justice? Is this what we mean by those things? Are we justified in condemning Leopold and Loeb not because they chose to commit their crimes, but because the spectacle of their punishment reinforces social conventions and taboos? And does this intuition generalize? If so, when considering whether to impose criminal punishment, should we be prioritizing its utility for social cohesion over any concerns about moral responsibility and agency? And finally, does identifying moral agency with the mechanical functioning of the brain risk stigmatizing or dehumanizing anyone who deviates from socially acceptable forms of neurotypicality? So that's one way to approach this issue from a hard determinist perspective. And now we're going to switch that up a little bit and take a look at what is perhaps the most widely accepted attempt to navigate this path between free action and causal determinism, which is a position that is known as compatibilism or soft determinism. So the compatibilist is going to reject the first premise of Darrow's argument, that no action is free if it must occur, right? Instead, the compatibilist is going to maintain that determinism and freedom are in fact perfectly compatible with one another, hence compatibilism. So, the origins of the compatibilist position can be traced back to David Hume, whose dismantling of causation we encountered back in Module 3. So Hume challenged the necessary connection between events, arguing that all we ever actually witness is the constant conjunction of one thing followed by another, right? So he's going to apply the same empiricist criteria to human action as well. Hume reasons that all we ever actually observe, when we introspect, when we look at, internally, all we ever actually observe is the regular succession of mental events, of wanting, of deciding, of intending, followed by corresponding physical movements. Again, it's just one thing after the other. We think that there's this difference, but ultimately he thinks that from an empiricist perspective, it's the same thing. We observe that there is this mental event, this intention, this wanting, this intending, and that is followed by a corresponding physical action. You want to raise your arm, and your arm raises. Now, this is kind of the Humean mosaic again, but turned inward, transforming the theater of consciousness into this sort of sequence of psychological events with no metaphysical glue binding them together. Now, Hume's going to dismiss the historical dispute between necessity and liberty as merely verbal, which is going to set the stage for the entire compatibilist project. Freedom, when you strip it of all its metaphysical pretensions, is simply going to be the absence of external coercion. It's the regular conjunction between willing and acting, free from any outside interference. If you will something and it occurs and nothing stops it from occurring, nothing prevents that action from happening, then that is really what we mean by freedom. In a contemporary formulation of this, W.T. Stace is going to articulate a more detailed version of this, arguing that philosophers who deny free will are simply confused about what the word freedom means in ordinary language, how we actually use the term. So they incorrectly assume that free will requires actions to be uncaused or unpredictable, right? And Stace is going to counter that by suggesting that the true definition of freedom has nothing to do with whether an action is caused, but instead it has to do with how that action is caused. So, an action is free, according to Stace, when it is immediately caused by the agent's internal psychological states, their desires, beliefs, values, and character. And you can see how this traces back to Hume's position. An action is unfree, on the other hand, when its immediate cause lies outside of the agent, when it's something external, such as when someone is physically forced to act against their will. Again, it's if the internal desire, intent, is followed by the action, in Stace's term, causes the action, rather than, and it isn't prevented by external coercion, then it's free. And this is, from his perspective, the common sense use of the term freedom. This is what we mean. When we typically say that someone acted freely, all that we mean is that they acted according to their own will, and were not forced to act against their will. We sort of intuitively understand that actions resulting from coercion, manipulation, or addiction, severe mental illness, things like that are unfree. Similarly, we don't typically use the word free to refer to actions that were not caused by our internal states, that were just happened, just random. Concerns about the metaphysical nature of causation don't typically enter into our normal, ordinary language considerations about freedom when we're using this term. Now, Harry Frankfurt is going to offer a defense of compatibilism that's going to specifically address concerns about moral responsibility. Now, Frankfurt's going to challenge what's known as the principle of alternative possibilities, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later when we get to James. But the idea is that moral responsibility requires the ability to have done otherwise. That's a necessary condition. You have to have had the ability to make a different choice in order to be considered morally responsible for your action. Now, Frankfurt's going to formulate the series of famous thought experiments, which are now referred to as Frankfurt-style cases, or FSCs. That's how famous they are. They got named after them. So Frankfurt demonstrates in these cases that moral responsibility is not, in fact, grounded in the possibility of alternative choices, but instead is going to depend upon whether the action originates from the agent's own internal motivational structure. So again, he's making the compatibilist case that it's if the action results from our internal intentions and desires, that's what it means for an action to be free. Not that there had to be this metaphysical possibility of an alternate outcome, right? And I'm not going to get into the weeds on how Frankfurt demonstrates this. The article is great. Take a look at it. It's really well argued, but it also is fairly complicated. But what it's trying to demonstrate is that you don't have to have the possibility of alternate possibilities don't have to exist in order for one to be morally responsible for your actions. What's required is that your actions are caused by your internal motivations, right? This can be challenged, though, and has been challenged by many people. One of those people, the one that is in our readings, is Neil Levy. And he's going to reject this a presumed distinction between an agent's internal capacities, and he's going to reframe this in terms of capacities, our ability to do things. And he's going to reject the notion that we can really distinguish between someone's internal capacities and their embedded or environmental context, the external context, that there's this clear distinction between the internal and the external. Now, if you recall back from Module 4, we talked a little bit about what's known as the 4 E's of situated cognition, which are that cognition is embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. Now, the same model applies to agency as well. So, challenges to Frankfurt-style cases, such as Levy's, question the notion that agency is the sort of property that can be exclusively grounded in an individual's internal states, without any sort of reference to their context, to their environment, to their situation, to their bodies, that it's internal in the sense of a mental state rather than something that relates to the body or the environment or the culture or the way we interact with the world. Instead, people who are going to challenge this notion on those grounds are going to argue that agency functions more as this complex web of interactions between individuals and their environments and situations and contexts, that it's more complicated than that it's more embedded, that it's more interwoven, that we can't so clearly pull the internal and the external apart. Contemporary theorists, and Jane Bennett and Andy Clark are 2 examples from very different philosophical traditions, who both emphasize what's known as a distributed model of agency, so distributed agency, which reconceptualizes decision-making capacity as a function that extends beyond this narrow internalized model of mental states or even physical brain states like Churchill was talking about. And instead, they're going to argue that agency, that decision-making, that free will, if you want to call it that, ultimately supervenes more broadly upon extended human and non-human systems, these sort of coupled systems that aren't just inside your head. And what they're trying to do is, these are ways to address the Cartesian problem, right? We're trying to get the mind out of the Cartesian theater and back into the world. So they're going to suggest that agency supervenes more broadly upon this coupling of human and non-human systems, encompassing and permeating throughout the social and technological assemblages of the world. So agency isn't something that can be clearly distinguished between, okay, this is just caused by these internal mental states with no reference to context or environment or culture or technology, but in fact all of these things, both human and non-human, both individual and environmental, both singular and social, all of these things play a role, are part of the process through which agency emerges. And I wish we had more time to talk about this, because honestly this is one of the more interesting conversations that's happening around the topic of agency right now, but it gets us sort of outside of the content of this module. But I recommend looking into it. It's fascinating stuff. So, also, as we saw in Module 4, the attempt to formulate like this purely internalist account of agency is going to face a challenge from the direction of causal exclusion as well, right? So if mental states supervene upon physical states, right? And if the physical world is a causally closed system, then it seems that our mental states are excluded from playing a role in determining our actions. This is the same logic that goes back to the causal exclusion problem from Module 4 when we were talking about qualia and phenomenal characteristics. So the true causes of our behavior appear to be neural events, just as Churchland is suggesting, and not psychological states like desires and beliefs. There's no work left over once the physical causal functions of firing neural synapses resulting in whatever the action is, raising your arm or whatever. Once that physical process is played out, there's no work for psychological states to do. Agency becomes divorced from phenomenal consciousness, and we're left once more as epiphenomenal specters in the Cartesian theater. We always find ourselves aware of our actions just kind of immediately past the point where our bodies have begun to perform them. And this is a conclusion that follows from a series of experiments, laboratory experiments performed by a guy named Benjamin Libet, which demonstrates that our awareness of an action tends to come after, our consciousness of an action tends to come after the neural activation occurs. So the body has already started to do the thing before we're aware of intending to do the thing. Again, that's fascinating stuff that we really don't have enough space to get into here, but it's worth looking into. So applying this compatibilist framework to the case of Leopold and Loeb, the compatibilist would likely maintain that Leopold and Loeb acted freely in performing the murder, since their actions flowed from their own desires and intentions without any external coercion. The fact that these desires themselves were causally determined does not undermine either their freedom or their responsibility. Now, this approach does indeed preserve the language of moral responsibility, so it gets that job done. But does this kind of austere redefinition of freedom, this ambiguousness around the word freedom, does this truly capture what we mean when we speak of human agency? Is that what we're talking about? Is this the kind of freedom that we're referring to, just freedom from coercion? Not freedom in the sense of not being causally determined by events originating in the Big Bang, but or has the compatibilist simply changed the subject altogether here? So that is the compatibilist solution to the problem of free will. Now we're going to look at a third approach to this sort of metaphysical puzzle of agency. And this one is known as metaphysical libertarianism. So the libertarian rejects the second premise of Darrow's argument, which is every event has antecedent conditions that ensure that it must occur. So against determinism, libertarians are going to maintain that at least some human choices are not necessitated by prior causes. Right? So the libertarian position draws strength from our phenomenology of choice. What does that mean? That means our personal subjective experience of deliberating between alternative possibilities, right? To use Thomas Nagel's example, when you choose to eat a piece of cake instead of a peach for dessert, it seems that you could have genuinely chosen otherwise, right? Everything could have been exactly the same up to the moment where you made that choice, and yet you might have selected the peach instead. The sense of alternative possibilities seems fundamental to our conception of agency, of what it means to have free will. And this is called the principle of alternative possibilities, or the PAP. And it's the idea that the genuine ability to have done otherwise is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. William James is going to give a pretty vivid illustration of this principle in The Dilemma of Determinism, our reading, when he imagines himself walking home after a lecture and deliberating between taking Oxford Street or Divinity Avenue, which is these two different roads that he's leaving the lecture, and he's got two different paths that he can take. Now, James is going to use this to illustrate a stark contrast between two different perspectives, right? From the perspective of the agent prior to making the choice. So from the perspective of James, just deliberating over which one to take. From his perspective, both Oxford Street and Divinity Avenue both seem to be genuinely open possibilities. Right? Nothing about the history of the universe seems to be such that it is absolutely metaphysically necessary that he takes Divinity Street rather than Oxford, or Divinity Avenue rather than Oxford Street. But once the choice has been made, once he's gone down one of these two streets, from the determinist perspective, it appears as if whichever option James chose had been the only possibility the whole time. He could have never chosen otherwise, because the entire history of the universe was such that there was never a genuine choice. Now, James is going to say that we can't resolve this disagreement, this dispute, by any appeal to science or to any sort of definite facts. Because science generalizes from facts that exist, right? And not about possibilities that were never actualized. That's not the role of science. Instead, James is going to argue that we're going to have to make a choice between determinism and free will based on pragmatic considerations. And James, if you don't know, is one of the founders of the school, the philosophical school known as pragmatism, which alongside analytic philosophy and sort of continental style philosophy, pragmatism is the other really big school of Western philosophy. And is still a very robust school of philosophy. So James is going to suggest that we're going to need to make a choice based on pragmatic considerations. And in any case where we can't appeal to the facts, he's going to say that that's what we need to do. And in this case, it's going to be which assumption, between, again, free will and determinism, which assumption produces a more rational and satisfying conception of the universe for us, right? And James is going to argue against determinism, against the rationality of determinism, and argue for the rationality of a position he calls indeterminism, which is the thesis that some gap must exist within the universe, some fissure through which genuine chance or randomness can enter into our decisions. There has to be some space, some way for chance and randomness to enter into this deterministic picture in order to save us from the clockwork, in order to preserve a rational notion of agency and moral responsibility. Now, to demonstrate the rationality of indeterminism over determinism, James is going to outline a dilemma for the determinist based on an analysis of the concept of regret. And this is the dilemma of determinism. So we frequently wish that things had been otherwise than they are, right? That we had made different choices or that events had unfolded differently. But if the universe is deterministic and nothing could have ever been otherwise than it is, then our judgment of regret appears kind of incoherent, right? It doesn't make sense to regret that something occurred when it never had the possibility of not occurring. So we regret typically the existence of evil, for example. Terrible things happened and we experience regret about these things. We wish that they hadn't happened. But in a deterministic universe, any evil event that occurred, any evil that exists, could not have been otherwise. There's no possible world in which it didn't happen, right? The world appears to be shot through with evil at its core. Evil is baked into the universe. And to express regret over this fact, I mean, that seems like an error on our part, right? It's just, it could never have been otherwise. So why would we regret the existence of evil if there was no chance of it ever not occurring? It's just the way things are. But if our regret about the existence of evil is an error, then it's an error that we were destined to make according to the thesis of determinism. We couldn't have not felt that regret about the existence of evil. So the universe also appears to be shot through with necessary error. And this is the dilemma for the determinist, according to James. Either evil is necessary, which makes kind of nonsense of the notion of evil, right? I mean, if evil is necessary, what is how are we distinguishing it from something else? Or error is necessary, which makes nonsense of the notion of error. It can't be an error because it was something that was just necessarily going to be the case one way or another. There was no choice in whether or not we chose to regret this action that also never had a choice not to occur. So we're already getting into this sort of conundrum where this dilemma where either horn that we grab of the dilemma, whether it's the evil is necessary horn or the error is necessary horn, leads us to seemingly irrational, perhaps incoherent conclusions. So James is going to conclude on this basis that indeterminism gives you a way to talk about free will that's a more coherent framework that preserves the meaningfulness of our moral judgments and that avoids this irrationality that seems baked into the determinist position. And he's going to conclude with a famous declaration in his lecture, which is then preserved in the article that you read, where James famously declares that his first free act will be to declare his belief in his own freedom. Which James, by the way, if you want to, if there's any philosopher to read just as a prose stylist, and there's a few of them who are just really good writers, and William James and Friedrich Nietzsche are two that jump out. Actually, David Hume is a really good writer as well. There are also plenty of bad writers in philosophy, but James is great in my opinion, and I recommend his stuff highly. So, this premise that James is operating on, that our seemingly deterministic universe conceals some kind of hidden indeterminacy. Well, this has got some scientific support these days, right? This is, it's about 100 years ago that James gave this lecture. And now we have about a century of quantum mechanics behind us, which has replaced this mechanistic notion of a clockwork deterministic universe that concerned Descartes with a different picture, with this sort of counterintuitive ontology that involves things like objective probabilities and spooky action at a distance, and seemingly genuinely random, what's called stochastic processes, genuine randomness in nature, genuine chance, exactly what James was talking about. But does this actually solve the problem? And as Nagel and Churchland both point out in our readings, indeterminacy itself is not actually a sufficient condition to establish free agency, right? An action that has no cause, that's caused by some random quantum fluctuation, is no more the result of an agent's free choice than an action that was predetermined. That's still not something that is following from your will or your intention, right? It's just a random quantum event caused this to happen. That still doesn't seem to be what we mean by free will or agency. What's needed is some special kind of causation, where the agent somehow originates an action without being fully determined to do so. So, going back to the Leopold and Loeb case, if we look at this through the lens of metaphysical libertarianism about free will, it seems that Leopold and Loeb freely chose to commit murder when they could have chosen otherwise. They had the option of making a different choice, and they freely chose to do the crime, to do the horrible thing. Their choice wasn't necessitated by their upbringing, by their psychology, or any other prior cause. It was genuinely free, and this genuine freedom is precisely what makes them fully morally responsible for their actions. We are all condemned to freedom, is Jean-Paul Sartre's famous phrase. So that is the libertarian approach to the problem of free will. And to try to tie everything up here, the judge in the Leopold and Loeb case ultimately sentenced the defendants to life imprisonment rather than execution. While he rejected Darrow's total dismissal of moral responsibility, the judge did recognize that there were mitigating factors in environment and conditioning and surroundings and psychology that rendered the death penalty inappropriate. So he acknowledged the complexity of the interplay between free will and determinism in this case. And as we've seen, this debate resists any simple attempt at resolution. Each position, whether it's hard determinism, compatibilism, or libertarianism, they all offer insights while raising further questions. Hard determinism aligns with our scientific understanding of causation, but it challenges our fundamental moral intuitions. Compatibilism preserves moral responsibility while acknowledging causal determination, but it relies on a redefinition of freedom that many find unsatisfying or ambiguous. Libertarianism honors our subjective experience of choice, but it struggles to explain how freedom can exist in a law-governed universe. The metaphysics of agency exemplifies what Russell called the great speculative questions back in Module 1, the questions that may ultimately lie beyond the capacity of the human mind to resolve, but which force us to enlarge our minds to match their greatness. Even if we can't resolve the free will debate conclusively, engaging with it transforms our understanding of ourselves and our relationship to the world. In the following modules, the question of agency will remain central. Whether we can be held morally responsible for our actions ultimately depends on what kind of beings we are. Are we mechanisms governed by inexorable laws, or are we agents capable of genuine choice? The foundations of ethics and social justice, like the foundations of knowledge and mind that we've already explored, are comprehensible only against the background of our understanding of the nature of reality and our place within it. And that seems like a good place to end. So hope this was useful. There will be a handout accompanying the lecture as always, and it should hopefully theoretically address all of the questions, or at least give you clues to all of the questions on your assignments. So hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.